Rain drew thin lines on the windshield as Edward Hale settled into his wife's sedan. The seat still held Margaret's perfume. He told himself he'd only take the car to the lumberyard for screws and brackets, nothing more. The dash chimed. Low washer fluid. He opened the glove box for the manual. A tissue pack slid forward and a cream envelope snagged on the lip. Thick paper. Unsealed flap. Not a receipt. He should have shut the compartment. Instead his fingers moved. Inside lay a single page folded in thirds. Margaret's handwriting moved across the top, precise, neat. The first word stopped him. Daniel. His son-in-law. Claire's husband. Air left Edward in a quick, ashamed puff. He looked at the rain, then backed down because not knowing felt worse. I can't keep pretending the silence at home is enough. The tone wasn't wild. It was careful, intimate, the voice of someone practiced at confession. More lines followed, mild and devastating. You make me feel visible. Claire won't notice. One evening soon, ours alone. He swallowed. A watermark appeared when he tilted the page toward the light, Plaza Regent, a downtown hotel. In the lower margin, tiny pencil numbers, 612. Beside them, a brief arrow pointing to a word the fold had chewed away. A horn sounded behind him. He'd been idling in the driveway. He slid the sheet back, then, deliberate, guilty, beneath the manual. His phone buzzed. A text from Margaret, remember time. Ordinary words that suddenly felt like code. He started the engine. In the side mirror he noticed a brown thread on the passenger seat, her scarf, and a dusting of glitter fine as salt. He pinched it away and drove, careful as a man carrying a bowl filled to the rim. Hedges, mailboxes, puddles, his street passed in fragments that refused to comfort him. He pressed the wheel until his hands steadied. At a long red light he unfolded the sheet again, aligning the creases as she had made them. The upper left corner, where she usually wrote dates, was blank except for a pale ring, the ghost of a glass. He angled the page. The watermark brightened, the 612 sharpened. He pictured a carpeted hallway, anonymous, waiting. The light changed. He eased forward and tucked the letter under the registration. He would put it back later, exactly as found. He parked at the lumberyard and didn't get out. The engine ticked as it cooled. Rain thinned to a hush. He set the envelope on the passenger seat and tried the name softly, as if volume could change truth. Daniel. The glove box closed around the secret with a soft click. Edward placed his hands on his knees and breathed in the car that smelled like Margaret and somewhere he did not recognize. He wasn't ready to accuse, not ready to forgive. He was only ready to admit the house he had built had a crack, and inside that crack the numbers 612 waited, patient as a locked door he would have to open. Outside, a siren wailed far off. Edward gripped the key. Tomorrow, he'd look. The house glowed with its usual evening warmth. Lamps spilled golden light over the oak table Edward had built decades ago, each nick and scratch a memory of family meals, birthday candles, and late-night conversations. Tonight, however, the room felt staged, too tidy, too rehearsed, as if everyone sitting there were actors playing a part. Margaret moved around the kitchen in her soft blue dress, the hem brushing just above her knees. Her laughter chimed as she carried a casserole dish to the table, her smile steady but her eyes quick to glance toward the front door. Edward noticed the glances, they weren't for him. The sound of a car outside broke the silence, followed by the crunch of gravel. Moments later, Daniel walked in with Claire, his suit jacket open, hair still perfect from the office. He kissed Claire on the cheek, then Margaret on hers, longer than polite, lighter than husbandly. Edward's chest tightened, but he said nothing. "Dad," Claire said brightly, slipping out of her coat. "You should have seen Daniel today. He closed another big account at work. They practically begged him to take the contract." Daniel laughed, modest only in tone, not in expression. "Hard work pays off." But, of course, Margaret already heard the details earlier. His eyes flickered to Edward's wife in a way that seemed too familiar. Edward's fork scraped against his plate. "Congratulations," he murmured, forcing his voice steady. He looked at Margaret, her cheeks slightly flushed, her eyes avoiding his, and then at his daughter. Claire's faith in Daniel was unshakable. She leaned on him as though he were the foundation of her life. Margaret poured wine into Daniel's glass first. Not Edward's. Not Claire's. His first. It was such a small act, yet Edward felt it lodge deep in his chest. The conversation carried on, mundane talk of Claire's bakery struggling with rising flour costs, Daniel's endless self-praise, Margaret's gentle laughter at all his jokes. Edward sat quietly, observing the choreography. The stolen glances. The way Daniel's hand brushed against Margaret's when she set down a serving spoon. The subtle lean of their bodies toward one another when they thought no one was looking. But Edward was looking. He was always looking now. At one point, Claire excused herself to fetch a dessert she had baked earlier. The moment she disappeared into the kitchen, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his voice dropping slightly. "You always outdo yourself, Margaret. This," he gestured at the roast, "is perfection." Margaret's laugh was soft, private. Her hand lingered on the table near his. For just a second too long. Edward's knuckles whitened around his glass. His eyes drifted to the pocket of his jacket where the folded letter sat, a constant weight. Every word of it echoed in the back of his mind, "Claire won't notice." Claire returned with the dessert, humming, oblivious. She placed it in the center of the table, proud. Daniel quickly shifted back into the role of attentive husband, kissing her temple, telling her she was remarkable. Margaret smiled at them both as if she hadn't just betrayed her daughter with her silence. Edward forced a smile, though his stomach churned. He was no longer only a husband watching his wife slip away. He was a father watching his daughter lie blindfolded in a room full of knives. As dinner ended and everyone rose from the table, Edward gathered the plates, his movements deliberate. Margaret brushed past him, her hand grazing his arm. "Thank you for being quiet tonight," she whispered. Her tone was light, as though she meant his usual grumbling, but Edward heard the undercurrent. She suspected nothing of what he knew. Later, as he stood by the sink washing dishes, he watched through the window as Margaret and Daniel stepped outside together, laughing under the porch light while Claire fetched coats from upstairs. Margaret's hand lingered on Daniel's sleeve. Their silhouettes merged briefly in the glow. Edward dried his hands on a towel. His reflection in the dark glass of the window stared back at him, lined, worn, but sharper than it had been in years. He whispered to himself, steady and low, "Tomorrow." And as he spoke, his eyes drifted to the folded letter resting in his jacket pocket, the inked numbers, 612, burning through the paper like a silent signal. The night after dinner, Edward sat in his study, the one room of the house that still felt entirely his. Oak shelves lined with architectural sketches, a lamp casting a golden pool of light over the desk, and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. On the desk lay the letter. He had unfolded and refolded it so many times the creases had begun to fray. Margaret's handwriting stared back at him, neat, steady, betraying nothing of guilt, only intimacy. But what consumed him wasn't the words anymore. It was the faint pencil marks in the margin, 612. At first, he thought it might be nothing. A stray number. A doodle. But the more he stared at it, the more deliberate it seemed. The way the two curved neatly into the fold, the faint arrow pointing inward, as though Margaret herself had left the code. Edward rose and paced. The number pressed into his thoughts like an itch that wouldn't leave. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey, sat back down, and studied it again. The watermark on the paper caught the lamplight, Plaza Regent. Downtown. A hotel he had driven past 100 times but never entered. A place known, at least in whispers, for discretion. He leaned back, closing his eyes. The pieces clicked, the affectionate lines, the promise of one evening soon, the watermark, and then, 612. A hotel room number. His breath slowed. His pulse, however, did not. The whiskey sat untouched as he reached for his phone. He typed Plaza Region into the map search. There it was, only a 15-minute drive from their home. Reviews described it as quiet, private, perfect for business or getaways. Perfect for secrets, too. Edward leaned forward, resting his forehead in his hand. Every instinct told him to storm into the bedroom, confront Margaret, demand the truth. But that would be noise, emotion, chaos. And chaos left no evidence. Instead, he opened the hotel's website. He scrolled through the photos, the marble lobby, the red-carpeted hallways, the numbered doors with brass plaques. His eyes locked on one image, room 612. The photo was promotional, just another guest room, but to Edward it felt like staring into the mouth of betrayal. He set his jaw. Tomorrow, he would book a room. Across the hall. He would see for himself. Later that night, he returned the letter to the envelope and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. As he left the study, he heard Margaret humming faintly from their bedroom. The sound should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a stranger had taken her voice. When he entered the room, Margaret looked up from her mirror. She was removing her earrings, her reflection calm, almost angelic in the soft light. "You're up late," she said lightly. "Just paperwork," Edward answered. His voice was steady. Too steady. She smiled faintly, set the earrings down, and slid under the covers. Edward watched her in silence for a long moment. The woman lying there was his wife of 35 years, the mother of his daughter. Yet, in his mind, she was also the author of a letter to another man. When Margaret closed her eyes, Edward turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room, but sleep never came to him. He lay awake, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, the number 612 burning behind his eyelids. By morning, his decision was made. He dressed in a crisp shirt, more carefully than usual. When Margaret asked where he was heading, he said simply, "Downtown." No further questions came. She was already on the phone with Claire, discussing something about the bakery. Edward drove with the letter on the passenger seat, his hand occasionally brushing against it as though to remind himself it was real. When he reached the Plaza Region, he parked across the street, watching through the windshield as businesspeople and couples drifted through the revolving doors. The building loomed, polished, indifferent. Finally, he stepped out, straightened his jacket, and walked inside. The lobby smelled of polished wood and faint cologne. A pianist played softly in the corner. Edward approached the front desk, his heart steady, his mind clear. "Good afternoon, sir." "How can I help you?" the clerk asked with a professional smile. Edward returned the smile with one of his own, thin and unreadable. "I'd like a room," he said. "As close as possible to 612. The clerk tapped at the keyboard, unaware that every keystroke was sealing the next act of a betrayal that had only just begun. The hallway of the Plaza Region was hushed, its carpet muffling every footstep. Brass numbers gleamed on each door, the overhead lights set low, giving the space the dim reverence of a chapel where secrets were worshipped instead of prayers. Edward's room was 611. When the clerk had handed him the keycard, she had chirped, "Just across from 612, sir." Quiet floor, very private. Private. Exactly what they wanted. Exactly what he needed. He entered his room, pulled the curtains shut, and switched on only the desk lamp. The air smelled faintly of cleaning agents and lavender. Dropping his overnight bag on the chair, he sat at the edge of the bed, facing the door. His jacket pocket was heavy with the folded letter, like an anchor pinning him to his purpose. From where he sat, the peephole in his door framed the opposite side of the hall, room 612, its brass numbers gleaming softly. The stage was set. All he had to do was wait. Hours crawled by. He drank water from a glass, barely touched the food he ordered. At 7:48, the elevator down the hall dinged. Footsteps echoed. Edward pressed his eye to the peephole. Margaret. She stepped out gracefully, dressed not in her usual muted tones, but in a wine-red dress that clung to her like memory. a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, the same one that had left threads in the car. She looked younger, deliberate, as though she'd rehearsed this performance. She glanced around once, then walked to room 612. Her hand trembled only slightly as she slid a card through the lock. The door opened. She disappeared inside. Edward's throat tightened. He leaned back from the peephole, fists clenching, his pulse hammering in his ears. Minutes later, the elevator chimed again. Daniel. The younger man strode down the hall with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the world bent toward him. His tie was loosened, his hair styled just so. He carried a bottle of wine in one hand, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Edward's stomach twisted as Daniel tapped twice on 612. The door opened immediately. Margaret pulled him inside, her laugh soft and warm. Then the door clicked shut. Edward closed his eyes. The walls were thin enough to betray whispers and faint clinks of glasses. Laughter. A sigh that made Edward's jaw lock. He sat in the chair by the door, hands folded tightly, listening not to words but to tones, rhythms, an intimacy he hadn't heard from Margaret in years. Pulling out his phone, he opened the recorder. He didn't want to, yet his finger pressed the button. Every sound from across the hall became evidence, fuel, a thread in the web he was weaving. At one point, Daniel's voice rose slightly. Claire will never know. She trusts me too much. Margaret's reply was a whisper Edward barely caught. Edward doesn't see me anymore. Not really. You do. Edward's hand shook as he ended the recording. He set the phone down and pressed his palms over his face. 35 years of marriage reduced to murmurs through a hotel wall. At 9:30, there was silence, then muffled laughter again. The sound of glasses clinking, footsteps on carpet. Edward stood, moved to his peephole. The door to 612 opened briefly as Daniel stepped into the hallway to fetch ice. Edward caught a glimpse inside, the warm glow of lamps, Margaret seated on the bed, smiling in a way Edward hadn't seen in decades. Daniel returned with the ice bucket. The door shut again. Edward retreated, sat back on his bed, and stared at the ceiling. His breathing slowed. The rage inside him settled into something colder, sharper. This was no longer just about betrayal of love. It was about Claire, their daughter, being married to a man who could deceive her so easily. And Margaret, her own mother, complicit in it. Edward glanced at the letter once more. The words swam before his eyes, but now the numbers, 612, burned brightest. By midnight, the hallway fell silent again. Edward remained awake, staring at the door across from him, as if daring it to open. When it finally did, Margaret emerged first, adjusting her scarf, her face flushed but composed. Daniel followed moments later, checking his watch before giving her a lingering look. Edward didn't move. Didn't breathe. The door to 612 shut with a quiet finality. Margaret and Daniel walked down the hall, footsteps fading toward the elevator. Edward sat in the stillness, a calmness washing over him. The proof was real. The betrayal was undeniable. And tomorrow, he promised himself, the foundation would crack. Morning light poured through the thin curtains of the hotel room, sharp and unforgiving. Edward had not slept. He sat at the desk, staring at the empty glass in front of him, replaying every whisper he had overheard the night before. The image of Margaret laughing in that red dress haunted him, a vision so vivid it almost felt carved into his mind. When the clock struck 7 o'clock, Edward folded the letter once more, sliding it carefully back into the envelope. He slipped it into his jacket pocket like a weapon she didn't know he carried. Then he reached for his phone. His thumb hovered over a name he hadn't called in years, Harold Green. Harold had been a lawyer for decades, a sharp man with a reputation for uncovering the fine print others overlooked. He and Edward had shared drinks in younger days, their conversations a blend of law and architecture, both obsessed with foundations, legal or structural. They hadn't spoken much since retirement, but Edward knew Harold was the only man he could trust now. He pressed call. The line rang twice before a gravelly voice answered, "Edward? It's been years. Edward's voice came low, steady, though his pulse quickened. I need your help. And I need it quiet. There was a pause on the line. Quiet usually means trouble. Betrayal, Edward said simply. My wife. My son-in-law. They're planning something, Harold. It's not just an affair. He's after Claire's business. He's been making her sign documents. I need to know how deep it goes. Harold's voice grew firmer. You're saying fraud? Yes, Edward said. His hand trembled slightly, gripping the arm of the chair. And coercion. Claire trusts him blindly. I've seen the letters. Heard their words. They think she won't notice. Harold exhaled slowly, the sound of a man already calculating. If Daniel has manipulated Claire into transferring shares or signing over control, we can stop it, but I'll need proof. Real proof. Not just whispers in a hotel. Edward's eyes shifted to his phone on the desk. The audio file from last night glowed on the screen, ready. I have recordings. Enough to start. And a letter. Handwritten. From Margaret to Daniel. It mentions Claire directly. That's a good beginning, Harold replied. His tone carried no judgment, only focus. Listen to me carefully, Edward. Don't confront them yet. If you explode now, they'll hide everything. You need to gather documents, bank statements, business contracts, anything with signatures. If we act fast, we can freeze assets before he drains them. But you'll have to keep playing the dutiful husband. Can you do that? Edward closed his eyes. Images of Margaret's smile at dinner, her laughter through the hotel wall, stabbed through him. The idea of pretending, of sitting across from her as though nothing had shattered, felt impossible. But then he thought of Claire, his daughter, the girl who used to sit on his shoulders at the park, the woman who still baked him his favorite bread on his birthday. She was blind to Daniel's manipulation, still convinced she had chosen the perfect husband. For her, he could pretend. For her, he could wait. Yes, Edward said at last, his voice cold with resolve. I can do that. Harold's tone softened slightly. Good. I'll draft preliminary papers, just in case. If Daniel pushes for a transfer or tries to liquidate assets, we'll be ready to block it. But Edward, you need to understand. If Margaret is complicit, signing documents, helping him, she'll go down with him. Silence filled the line. Edward stared at the letter on the desk. One day, it will just be you and me. His hand tightened around the phone. Then she'll face the consequences of her choices. They spoke another 10 minutes, planning quietly. When the call ended, Edward slipped the phone back into his pocket, the weight of Harold's words pressing down on him. He stood, straightened his jacket, and looked once more at room 612 across the hall. The brass numbers gleamed in the morning light. This was no longer about pain. No longer about jealousy. It was about justice. He stepped into the hallway, his expression unreadable. The mask of silence was on. He was ready to wear it for as long as it took. But deep inside, something colder had awakened, an architect's patience, a builder's precision. Edward wasn't just collecting proof. He was laying the foundation for a reckoning. The Hale house smelled faintly of cinnamon when Edward walked in that evening. Claire had stopped by earlier, leaving behind a basket of pastries from her bakery. The kitchen table held the evidence, a half-empty plate of croissants, folded napkins, a handwritten note that read, "For you and Mom, don't forget to eat," with a heart scrawled at the bottom. Edward lingered over the note. Claire's trust in her mother, in her husband, in all of them, so complete, so unguarded, felt like a knife twisting deeper. He set the note down and turned when he heard Margaret humming in the living room, tidying books on the shelf as if the world hadn't shifted under their feet. He forced his voice into calm. "Claire around?" Margaret smiled without turning. She stopped by after lunch. Said she'd be at the cafe late, something about inventory. Daniel's with her. The name came like a stone dropped into Edward's chest. He nodded once and left the room before Margaret could read his face. That evening, Edward made his way to the cafe. Claire was at the counter, her apron dusted with flour, hair pulled back in a loose knot. She brightened at the sight of him. "Dad." "Twice in one day, I'm spoiled." Edward managed a smile. "Checking in on my favorite baker. Thought I'd see how things are going." She poured him a coffee, the way she always did, 2 sugars, no cream. "Busy. Daniel's been helping with the business side, thank God. I can handle ovens, not contracts." Edward stirred the coffee slowly, watching the swirl of sugar dissolve. His next words came with the weight of a man testing the strength of a beam. "What kind of contracts?" Claire leaned on the counter, casual, unbothered. "Oh, nothing huge. Some restructuring, some forms Daniel said would make taxes easier. He's good with that stuff, Dad. Honestly, I don't know what I'd do without him." Edward's hand stilled on the spoon. His pulse drummed in his ears. "Did you read them? Before signing?" She shrugged. "I skimmed. They all seemed routine. Daniel explained enough, and I trust him. He wouldn't steer me wrong." Trust. The word fell like a stone between them. Edward's stomach turned. He pressed gently, keeping his tone even. "Claire, you should always read everything. Even from people you trust." She gave a small laugh, light and dismissive. "Dad, you worry too much. You always have. Daniel's on my side. He wants what's best for both of us." Edward studied her face, open, warm, still full of the unshakable belief that love shielded her from harm. He saw Margaret's smile in her, the same smile that now seemed poisoned. "Just promise me," Edward said quietly, "if Daniel asks you to sign anything else, you'll show it to me first. Or Harold Green." Claire frowned slightly at the seriousness in his tone. "The lawyer?" "Dad, isn't that a little extreme?" "Promise me," Edward repeated, his eyes locking on hers. There was a beat of silence before she sighed. "Fine. I promise. But you're going to see you're wrong about him." Edward nodded slowly, forcing a smile. "Maybe I will." They spoke of lighter things after that, the cafe's new supplier, the bread she wanted him to try next week, but the weight of the earlier exchange stayed heavy in Edward's chest. He left with a pastry bag in hand, though the sweetness inside felt bitter now. Walking back through the cool night, Edward's thoughts churned. Claire was blind to the trap, walking straight into Daniel's carefully set snare. Margaret was no innocent bystander, her letter proved she was complicit. And if Claire trusted Daniel enough to sign papers without reading them, then Harold had been right. Edward would need more than recordings and letters. He'd need signatures, documents, hard proof that no one could deny. The cinnamon smell of the pastries followed him home, mingling with the ache in his chest. For Claire, he thought. For her, he would stay silent a little longer. But inside, his resolve hardened like poured concrete. The test was over. He had his answer. Claire was in danger, and it would fall to him, her father, to tear down the walls Daniel and Margaret were building around her. The Plaza Regent glowed with warm lights that spilled through its polished glass facade, but to Edward it looked like a furnace swallowing secrets whole. He walked through the revolving doors as though he belonged there, his posture straight, his eyes fixed. In his jacket pocket, the letter weighed heavier than any tool he had ever carried in his life. It was not just paper, it was a weapon. A blueprint for what he was about to do. Upstairs, the hallway was quiet, carpeted in that same hush that had betrayed Margaret's footsteps the first night. Edward stopped in front of room 612. He didn't knock. Not yet. He slipped a small card from his wallet, one he had secured with a bribe to the desk clerk earlier that week. The woman hadn't even asked questions. To her, he was just another discreet man arranging a quiet rendezvous. The lock blinked green. The door gave way with a soft click. Inside, the room was dimly lit by bedside lamps. The air smelled of wine and Margaret's perfume. She and Daniel froze where they stood by the table, a bottle already uncorked, 2 glasses half filled. Margaret's scarf was undone, hanging loose around her shoulders. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Margaret's face drained of color. "Edward," her voice cracked, brittle as glass. Daniel's arrogance faltered, replaced with the stiffness of a man caught off guard. He stepped forward, defensive. "This isn't what you think." Edward cut him off with silence. He closed the door behind him and walked calmly to the table. From his pocket, he withdrew the folded letter and placed it squarely between the glasses of wine. The sound of paper against wood was louder than any shout could have been. Neither Margaret nor Daniel moved. Edward spoke at last, his voice low, even. "I've built homes my entire life. When a crack appears, you can ignore it, patch it, pretend it isn't there. But eventually the whole structure collapses. Do you know why?" Neither answered. Margaret's hands trembled against her scarf. Daniel's jaw tightened. Edward leaned closer to the table, his eyes never leaving them. Because the damage was there from the beginning. Hidden in the foundation. Just like this. His finger tapped the letter once. Daniel finally broke the silence, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Edward, you're misunderstanding. She was just lonely. Nothing's happened. Nothing that can't be fixed." Margaret flinched at his choice of words. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Edward's lips curled in something between pity and disgust. He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out his phone. With one touch, he played the recording from the night before. Daniel's own voice filled the room. "Claire will never know. She trusts me too much." Followed by Margaret's whisper, "Edward doesn't see me anymore." "Not really." "You do." The sound ended, leaving a hollow silence. Margaret covered her mouth, horrified by hearing herself. Daniel's face went pale. Edward clicked the phone off and slipped it back into his pocket. His expression didn't waver. He straightened, his tone steady. "I'm not here to beg for explanations. Or forgiveness. I'm here to warn you." Daniel swallowed hard. "Warn me?" Edward's gaze sharpened, colder than they had ever seen. "Claire knows nothing yet. And I intend to keep it that way until I decide otherwise. But understand this, if you continue to touch her trust, her business, or her life, I will tear down everything you've built. Both of you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Edward, please." He raised a hand, silencing her. "You made your choice when you wrote that letter. Choices have consequences." Without another word, Edward turned and walked toward the door. The wine glasses stood untouched, the letter lying open like an exposed wound on the table. He paused at the threshold, his hand on the handle. For the first time, he let his voice drop into something sharp, final. "Enjoy your evening. It will be your last one in peace." The door clicked shut behind him. In the hallway, Edward stood for a long moment, breathing deeply, his fists unclenching slowly. He wasn't trembling anymore. Inside room 612, silence reigned. Margaret stared at the letter. Daniel cursed under his breath. Both knew the balance of power had shifted. Edward walked back to his room across the hall, calm, precise. His plan was no longer just revenge. It was justice, and it had begun. The Hale home looked unchanged, but Edward felt its walls differently now. The living room, once warm, seemed staged, every photo frame and cushion a prop in a theater of lies. Margaret sat on the sofa, knitting quietly, her eyes fixed on the needles but her mind elsewhere. The faint hum of the TV filled the silence. Edward entered, his steps calm, deliberate. She glanced up, startled, as though she hadn't expected him to return so soon from errands. Her hands fumbled slightly with the yarn before she masked it with a smile. "You're home early," she said lightly. Edward hung his jacket on the rack, careful not to reveal the folded letter still hidden in the inner pocket. His expression was measured, almost tired. "I thought we could have dinner together. Just us." Margaret blinked, her lips parting, caught off guard. "Dinner?" "Yes." He offered a faint smile. It's been too long since we've had a quiet evening without interruptions. Suspicion flickered in her eyes, but she smoothed it over quickly. That would be nice. At dinner, Edward poured wine into her glass first this time, a subtle reversal of the roles from the last family meal. Margaret noticed, her hand hesitated briefly as she took it. They ate in near silence, the sound of cutlery clinking against porcelain unnerving in its normality. Edward's gaze was calm, his tone soft whenever he spoke. If Margaret had expected fury, confrontation, or icy silence, she found none of it. Instead, there was composure. And that unnerved her more than anger ever could. "Claire called earlier," Margaret said, her voice tentative. "She's been busy with the cafe. Daniel's been helping her with suppliers and contracts." Edward nodded slowly. Daniel's always eager to help. His eyes lingered on her a second too long, and Margaret looked away. After dinner, Edward suggested a walk through the garden. The night air was cool, stars faint behind a thin veil of clouds. They strolled the stone path together, hands brushing once, though neither reached to hold the other's. Margaret finally broke the silence, her voice low, strained. "Edward, about last night." He stopped, turning to her with a gentle smile. "We don't need to speak of it." Her brow furrowed. "You mean, you're not?" "I'm tired, Margaret," Edward interrupted softly. "Tired of conflict. Of suspicion. We've been married 35 years. If there's been mistakes, I'd rather not let them poison what time we have left." Her lips trembled. Relief flooded her features, mixed with guilt. She nodded quickly, grasping at his words like a lifeline. "You're right. We can move past it. Start fresh." Edward laid a hand gently on hers. "Yes. A fresh start." His voice carried warmth, but his eyes, cast in shadow, betrayed nothing. Later that night, as Margaret slept beside him, her breathing deep and even, Edward lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His words replayed in his mind. A fresh start. But the promise was not for her. It was for Claire. For the family Daniel was corrupting, for the trust Margaret had shattered. On the nightstand beside him sat his phone. Earlier, in his study, he had sent Harold the audio files. The lawyer had replied with a simple message: "We're ready when you are. Papers in motion. Keep her calm." So Edward did. He kept his voice even, his smile soft, his anger hidden beneath layers of silence. Margaret believed his forgiveness. She believed the storm had passed. She even hummed again the next day while making tea, the sound light, almost cheerful. It was the hum of a woman who thought her secret was safe, her sins unpunished. But Edward's silence was not peace. It was the stillness before demolition. Every lie she told, every laugh she shared with Daniel, every tender glance Edward caught when she thought he wasn't looking, he stored them like bricks in a wall. And when the time came, he would bring that wall crashing down on both of them. By the end of the week, Margaret suggested a family dinner again. "We could all sit together, Claire, Daniel, you, me. Clear the air." Edward smiled faintly, his hand resting over hers. "That sounds perfect." But inside, his thoughts were already elsewhere. He pictured the cafe, Claire's bakery, the very place Margaret suggested. The perfect setting. The trap was nearly ready. All that remained was to let them walk into it, believing he had forgiven them. Believing he was weak. Believing, fatally, that they were safe. The cafe smelled of warm bread and coffee beans, a sweetness that belied the storm brewing in Edward's mind. Claire had shut down early that evening, proud to host a family dinner in her own space. The wooden tables gleamed under soft lights, candles flickering in jars she decorated herself. Claire flitted about, apron still on, cheeks flushed with excitement. "It'll be just us tonight," she said, placing cutlery neatly. "No staff, no customers. Just family." Edward's chest tightened at the word family. He looked around the cafe, the chalkboard menus, the rows of pastries cooling behind glass, the framed photos of Claire's first opening day. This was her world, the one Daniel had quietly begun worming his way into. Tonight, Edward would reclaim it for her. Margaret arrived first, carrying a bouquet of roses. She kissed Claire on the cheek, then glanced at Edward, relief softening her eyes. She still believed in the false peace he'd spun at home. He gave her a small, reassuring nod, letting her think the storm had passed. Then Daniel strode in, dressed in his usual polished suit, tie loosened just enough to appear casual. He kissed Claire lightly, patted her shoulder as though she were a child, and shook Edward's hand with false warmth. "Good to see you, sir," Daniel said smoothly. "I think tonight will do us all good." "Fresh start, yes?" Edward only smiled. "Yes. Fresh start." Dinner began with laughter, mostly Claire's. She shared bakery stories, funny mishaps with flour deliveries, dreams of expanding one day. Daniel chimed in occasionally, always redirecting praise toward himself. Margaret laughed at all his jokes, her eyes flicking to Edward with cautious hope. Edward said little. He ate slowly, watching. Every gesture, every glance between Margaret and Daniel, he catalogued. The silence he carried unsettled them more than any accusation could. Then, just as dessert was being served, a tray of Claire's custard tarts, the cafe door opened. 2 men in suits entered. They weren't customers. Claire blinked in surprise. "We're closed, I'm sorry." The taller man smiled politely. "Forgive us, ma'am. We're here on business." He looked at Edward. "Mr. Hale?" Edward set down his fork, his expression calm. "Yes." The man stepped forward and placed a folder on the table. "Per your request. We'll need signatures before proceeding." Daniel straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing. "What's this?" Edward didn't answer. He slid the folder toward Daniel, his gaze steady. Daniel opened it, scanning quickly. His confidence flickered. This is a freeze order." "On Claire's accounts?" "On my investments?" "On her business," Edward corrected quietly. "On everything you've been trying to siphon out of her name." Claire's brows furrowed. "Dad, what is he talking about?" Daniel forced a laugh, though his voice wavered. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just a misunderstanding. Edward's overreacting, as usual." Edward's hand tapped the folder lightly. "Misunderstanding? Shall we let the notary explain?" The second man, a notary public, stepped forward, producing stamped documents. "Your husband attempted to transfer controlling shares of your cafe into a joint trust under his and your mother's names. Without disclosure, that's fraud. These orders prevent the transfer." Claire's face drained of color. She turned to Daniel, disbelief etched across her features. You did what?" Daniel's composure cracked. "It was temporary. For taxes, for growth, Claire, you wouldn't understand. I was protecting us." Margaret's hands trembled. She looked at Edward, eyes wide with dawning horror. "Edward, please." He silenced her with a look, calm and unyielding. Claire rose abruptly, knocking her chair back. "You used me. Both of you?" "Claire, no." Margaret reached for her, but Claire stepped back, tears welling. Edward stood slowly, his voice steady, every word cutting with precision. "You signed papers you didn't read. You trusted him. And Margaret? She helped him. I told you both, choices have consequences." Daniel tried to gather himself, his voice hard. "This isn't over. You can't destroy me with paperwork." Edward met his eyes, unflinching. "I don't need to destroy you, Daniel. You've already done that yourself." The men in suits collected the signed acknowledgments. The folder clicked shut, final as a verdict. Daniel sat rigid, his mask of control slipping. Margaret buried her face in her hands. Claire stood shaking, staring at them as though seeing strangers. Edward reached for his daughter's hand. "It's over now, Claire. You're safe." But inside, he knew it wasn't finished. This was only the first crack in their facade. The real collapse was still to come. And he was ready to bring the whole rotten structure down. The cafe's candles had nearly burned down the stubs, wax pooling in shallow jars. The silence around the table was heavy, broken only by Claire's ragged breathing. Margaret dabbed her eyes with a napkin, trembling, while Daniel sat stiff, his fists clenched, a mask of arrogance barely holding. Edward, however, was calm. He sipped from his water glass as though they were still at an ordinary family dinner. His silence was not retreat, it was preparation. The bell above the cafe door jingled. Everyone turned. 2 uniformed couriers stepped in, each holding a thick envelope. Behind them, a sheriff's deputy followed, his presence commanding. "Delivery for Daniel Blake," one of the couriers said. His tone was polite, but his eyes sharp. Daniel frowned. "This is ridiculous. We're in the middle of dinner." The deputy stepped forward. "Mr. Blake? You've been served." He laid the envelope firmly on the table. The second courier placed another envelope beside it, this one marked with Margaret's name. Margaret's lips parted. "Me?" "Yes, ma'am." The courier slid it closer. Claire looked between them, confusion and fear spreading across her face. "What's happening?" Edward folded his hands neatly. "The beginning of consequences." Daniel tore the envelope open, scanning rapidly. His face drained of color, then flushed an angry red. "Fraud? Coercion? Attempted misappropriation? This is nonsense." Edward leaned forward slightly. His tone was measured, like an architect explaining an inevitable collapse. "You coerced Claire into signing away control of her cafe. You falsified trust documents. You manipulated her faith in you for profit. That's not nonsense, Daniel. That's crime." Margaret's hands shook as she opened her own envelope. Her eyes darted over the pages. "Complicit?" she whispered. "No, Edward, this isn't right." "I didn't." Edward's gaze cut to her, sharp as a blade. "Your signature is on half the forms. You lent him credibility. You held the pen that helped him steal from our daughter. That makes you complicit." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "I didn't know what I was signing. I thought." "You thought you were helping him," Edward said quietly. "You thought betraying me in secret wouldn't bleed into betraying Claire. But you were wrong." Claire's face twisted with pain. "Mom, how could you?" Margaret reached for her daughter, desperate. "Claire, please, I only wanted to support you." Claire recoiled. "By handing my life over to him? By lying to me?" Daniel slammed his fist against the table, the plates rattling. "Enough. This is a stunt. Edward set this up. He's jealous, bitter, and now he's trying to destroy me with paperwork. It won't hold up." The deputy's voice cut through his tirade. "It'll hold up in court, Mr. Blake. You'll have your chance to argue there." Daniel's fury wavered. His bravado cracked at the edges. Edward remained still, his calm more terrifying than anger. "Paper cuts, Daniel. Small, sharp, and enough of them will bleed you dry. Every form you forged, every signature you stole, they've all been traced. I don't need to raise my voice. The law will do it for me." Margaret buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. Daniel stared at the documents, his jaw clenching, veins visible in his temples. Claire stood frozen, caught between grief and rage, her whole world shattering in an instant. Edward reached for her hand gently. "I warned you once, Claire. Trust is fragile. When it breaks, it cuts deep." She squeezed his hand back, tears sliding down her cheeks. The deputy nodded respectfully to Edward before turning toward the door. "Mr. Hale, everything is in motion now. We'll keep you informed." Edward inclined his head, his voice steady. "Thank you." The deputy and couriers left, the cafe bell jingling once more. Silence lingered after their departure. Daniel glared at Edward, eyes full of venom, but said nothing. Margaret's sobs filled the room. "Claire, pale and trembling, whispered, "I don't even know who you are anymore." Edward's eyes shifted to Daniel, then to Margaret. His words came low, final. "Neither of them are who you thought they were. But you'll learn. Tonight is just the first cut." He rose, placing a steady hand on Claire's shoulder. "Come. We're going home." As father and daughter left the cafe, the once warm and fragrant space felt like a crime scene. Inside, Daniel sat trapped by his own arrogance, Margaret crushed by her complicity. And Edward, walking into the night beside his daughter, knew the structure he had weakened was beginning to collapse. But the heaviest blow was still to come. The following morning, the Hale house was heavy with silence. Margaret sat at the edge of the bed, her hands clenched around the folded envelope she had been served the night before. The early sunlight painted her face pale, her eyes swollen from a night of weeping. Edward stood by the window, curtains drawn halfway. His posture was composed, his gaze fixed beyond the garden where he had once planted roses for her. He did not turn when she spoke. "Edward, you can't believe I meant to hurt Claire. I didn't know what Daniel was doing. I just signed where he told me." Her voice cracked, desperate. At last Edward turned, his expression unreadable. "No, Margaret. You didn't just sign where he told you." She frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Edward walked across the room, his steps steady, and placed a thin folder on the nightstand beside her. Inside were photocopied documents, stamped and notarized. Her trembling hands opened it. Her eyes scanned the pages, then froze. The blood drained from her face. These aren't mine," she whispered. "I never." "You did," Edward said firmly. His voice carried no malice, only precision, the tone of a man laying blueprints on the table. "Months ago. You forged my name." Margaret's breath hitched. "What?" Edward leaned closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "The bridge loan. Daniel wanted capital, $200,000. He couldn't get approval alone. So you signed my name as guarantor." The bank flagged the handwriting as irregular. "They contacted me." Margaret's lips parted in shock, but no words came. "I didn't confront you then," Edward continued, his voice calm but cutting. "I wanted to believe it was a mistake. But last night, when I placed that letter on the table, I saw the truth. You weren't just complicit in Daniel's fraud, you enabled it long before." Margaret dropped the papers, her hands shaking violently. "Edward, I only did it for Claire. Daniel said it was for her business, to help her expand. I thought," she trailed off, burying her face in her hands. Edward's jaw tightened. "You thought lies could build a foundation. But lies don't hold weight. They crumble. And now you've dragged Claire into the rubble." Downstairs, Claire's voice called softly. "Dad? Mom?" She stepped into the doorway, her eyes tired, her face pale. She must have heard enough from the landing. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling. Margaret rose quickly, tears streaking down her cheeks. "Claire, listen to me, I didn't mean to. Is it true?" Claire's voice broke, louder this time. Margaret froze, unable to answer. Her silence was admission enough. Claire's knees weakened, her back pressing against the doorframe. You lied to me. You lied to Dad. You lied to everyone." "Claire, please," Margaret begged, reaching for her. "I thought I was helping. I thought Daniel." Claire flinched away from her touch. Her voice was hoarse, raw with betrayal. "You forged Dad's name. You nearly destroyed my business. And all this time you were," her eyes filled with tears, but her voice sharpened. "With him." The room pulsed with the weight of the truth. Edward stepped forward, steadying Claire by her shoulders. His voice was low, but every word carried iron. "This is what I meant when I told you trust is fragile. Margaret chose Daniel over her family. She chose him over you." Margaret's sobs filled the silence, but neither Edward nor Claire moved to comfort her. Edward looked down at his wife, the woman he had loved for 35 years, the mother of his daughter, the architect of her own undoing. Daniel will face the courts, Edward said coldly. But you, Margaret, you'll face something worse. You'll face us. And that judgment is heavier than any sentence. Margaret sank into the chair, her body folding inward, consumed by guilt. Edward guided Claire gently from the room. She leaned against him, broken, but safer than she had been the day before. As they descended the stairs, Claire whispered, her voice trembling. She was supposed to protect me, Dad. And she was the one who hurt me most. Edward tightened his arm around her shoulders. His gaze hardened. Yes, he said softly. And now she'll live with that truth. Forever. Upstairs, Margaret sat alone, the folder of documents scattered on the floor, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on her like stone. Downstairs, Edward and Claire stepped into the morning light. For them, it was the beginning of freedom. For Margaret, it was the beginning of a sentence no court could deliver. The trial against Daniel moved faster than anyone expected. The recordings Edward had captured, the forged contracts, and Margaret's signature on the fraudulent loan documents painted a picture so damning that even Daniel's slick lawyers couldn't spin it. Newspapers wrote about it for weeks, local entrepreneur caught in family fraud scandal. His face, once the symbol of confidence and charm, was now splashed across headlines as a con man. Claire sat through every hearing, her father at her side. She never once looked at Daniel, even when he tried to lock eyes with her, mouthing desperate apologies. She only kept her gaze forward, her hands gripping Edward's like a lifeline. When the gavel finally fell, Daniel was sentenced. Fraud, coercion, forgery, years behind bars. He shouted in the courtroom, wild and broken, blaming Edward for setting him up, blaming Margaret for not protecting him, blaming everyone but himself. His voice echoed down the halls as they dragged him away in cuffs. Margaret sat at the back of the courtroom that day, hidden beneath a shawl, her face gray with shame. No sentence had been handed down for her, Edward had made no move to press charges for the forgery of his name. But the weight of her guilt, the scorn in her daughter's eyes, was punishment enough. She tried to catch Claire's gaze once. Claire turned away. Weeks later, the Hale house was quieter than ever. Margaret had moved into the guest room, her presence a ghostly echo in the halls. She no longer hummed while cooking. She no longer tried to reach for Edward's hand. The silence between them was absolute. One evening, as rain tapped softly at the windows, Edward entered his study carrying the letter, the same cream envelope that had started it all. He sat by the fireplace, its embers glowing faintly, and unfolded it one last time. One day, it will just be you and me. The words no longer made his chest ache. They felt empty, powerless. Claire entered quietly, standing in the doorway. Dad? Edward glanced at her, offering a small smile. It's finished now. She stepped closer, her voice low, thick with lingering pain. I still can't believe, Mom, all of it. Edward rose, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. Betrayal is like rot in the walls. You don't see it until it's already spread. But we've torn it out now. And you'll rebuild stronger. Claire nodded, though her eyes glistened. Edward turned back to the fire. With a steady hand, he fed the letter into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, and dissolved into ash. The final proof of Margaret's treachery vanished in smoke. The next morning, Edward called a notary to the house. Claire watched as he signed papers transferring the house into a trust solely in her name. Margaret stood in the doorway, silent, her face pale as she realized what it meant. You're securing her future, Edward said plainly, not looking at his wife. This house belongs to Claire now. Everything I have will be hers. You and Daniel nearly took it from her once. That will never happen again. Claire whispered, Dad, you don't have to. I do, Edward cut in, his voice resolute. This is her foundation. She deserves to stand on something solid. That night, Margaret packed a small bag. She didn't say where she was going, and Edward didn't ask. Claire watched from the window as her mother walked down the path in the rain, shoulders hunched, disappearing into the distance. No words of farewell passed between them. Weeks later, Edward sat on the porch, sipping tea. The garden was quiet, the roses blooming again. Claire stepped outside, sitting beside him. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. Edward considered her words, his gaze steady on the horizon. "Regret builds nothing. Justice, though, it restores balance." She rested her head against his shoulder. For the first time in months, Edward allowed himself a long, deep breath. The foundation was cracked, yes, but he had rebuilt it with truth. And the ashes of betrayal had been left exactly where they belonged, behind them, cold and forgotten.